Pulitzer Prize winning author and oncologist Dr. Siddhartha Mukherjee has probably done more than anyone else in the world to demystify science and medicine for people like you and me. His latest book, The Song of the Cell, is an ode to what he calls the basic unit of life. But then the book goes on to ask the tantalizing and intriguing question, what is life? Joining us now is Dr. Mukherjee himself. It's good to see you, Siddharth, in person rather than the other end of a crackly internet line. It's a fascinating book, the third after The Emperor of Maladies and your book on the gene. Tell me, before we talk about the book, what do you remember about the first cell that you ever cultured?
Well, it was at Oxford, where I was a graduate student. I had worked before. When I was in college on genes and genetics, but not really on cell biology. And so I was at Oxford when I really cultured my own my first cells. Learned so I had plated the cells at night, and in the morning I took a look down the microscope, and it was a T cell. And I was learning to culture T cells, and amazingly, there it was. Sort of, I call it sort of, Barkha, the one thing is that when you learn to look at cells, you sort of become like a gardener. The way you look at plants. You learn basically by looking at a cell, and I try to teach my students this, my graduate students this. By looking at a cell, you can tell a lot about the life of the cell, whether it's happy, whether it's unhappy, just like you can, like gardeners look at plants. And there it was. And what's amazing about it is that while I was looking at it, it started moving, and you all of a sudden realize that you've basically cultured, or you're holding life in your hands.
But the analogy with the gardening is very intriguing, because people sing to their plants and they believe that the plants will blossom if you sing to them.
Right.
One of the things your book says is that we do not yet know how to sing to ourselves. We do not understand their song.
Yeah, the title, actually, it's an interesting book. Usually, I title my books very late in the book, and the title sort of comes to me in a kind of dreamy way. This book had a different title, and it wasn't working for a long time, and I was struggling with the title. And then it just came to me in a flash, and I was like, of course, that's the title. So the title, The Song of the Cell, refers to two ideas, and two very important ideas. The first idea is that we've talked a lot in the public discourse about genes. And genes are units of information. They're carried in DNA, the molecule. But what's interesting is, and what often people don't realize, is that genes themselves are lifeless. They are units of life. They carry the information to build life, but they're lifeless. It's the cell that sings it out. Just like a musician sings out a score. A score is lifeless. You need a symphony or a musician or a group of musicians to play that score and therefore enliven it. In the same way, you need a cell to bring genes to life. It's otherwise lifeless, so hence the song. But there's another song. So that song we're learning to read, we're learning to understand. But there's another song which is sort of we encounter much later in the book. And that's the song or the intercommunication between cells. How, for instance, one cell in the immune system speaks to another cell in the immune system and thereby creates what I call a coordinated sense of life. It's not random. Those cells the neurons in your brain speak to other neurons in your brain. That's not random. That song, which is the song that goes between cells, is something that still remains somewhat mysterious and was made. The fact that it was a mystery was made even more clear during the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, we'll come to COVID, but I think not many people who are outside of medicine and science understand what you explain in this book, that whether it is IVF, whether it is cancer, whether it is depression, whether it is multiple sclerosis, whether it is HIV, it all comes down to the cell, both the sort of rebellion of the cell, as well as medicine's attempt then to treat the cell and therefore treat the infection. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, this is an idea that was really a revolutionary idea, initially by Rudolf Virchow and then subsequently by many other people. But the idea, it's so simple that it's almost missed, which is that, we think of many things as caused by the environment or initiated by the environment or psychosocial things, depression being one of them. But ultimately, for it to have an effect in the human body, it has to go through through cells. Even diseases that we think are, psychosocial, situational, grief, depression, all the way to, cancer, as you said, multiple sclerosis, ultimately it has to do with dysfunction of cells. So the central message in some ways in this book, and of course the central message in the world of biology, is that everything that we do, every activity, every life activity that we do is based on cells, and every disease is a dysfunction of cells. So if you want to do medicine, if you want to learn medicine, if you want to understand the basis of any disease, and I really mean any disease, you have to understand its cell biological basis, what's gone wrong with the cell and how we can fix it. That's the basis of all medicine.
You mentioned depression, so let's talk about that. It's something you've said is personal for you. I have spoken to you before about your father.
Yep.
Your father who fought dementia in the later years of his life, then falls, eventually dies from the fall. You had a very, very moving piece in the New Yorker. I think we pulled it out as well for our viewers, and there's a beautiful photograph of you with him. And he dies, and then you, who has actually been traumatized because you know of your father's dementia, that maybe this is something that will pass down in the family, and you speak about, sort of almost breezily about the madness in the Mukherjee family, quote unquote. You also battle depression. That experience, your father and yourself, when you join the dots back to what you now understand about the cell as a unit of life, how do you join those dots?
Well, so, people think about depression in many different ways. It's it's kaleidoscopic. But to be, you could have it as a consequence of grieving, and the grieving doesn't go away. You could have it as a consequence of trauma. You could have it as a consequence of so many different, as I said, psychosocial inputs. But ultimately, if you look where it all impinges, it has to impinge on some nerve circuit somewhere in your brain.
Yeah.
And that nerve circuit is not functioning appropriately. That nerve circuit presumably regulates mood, so that your mood can swing up and swing down. You experience happiness when the situation is happy. In someone who's depressed, those rheostats, the capacity of your mood to swing appropriately gets offset, so that even under situations which would normally make you enjoy pleasure, enjoy happiness, enjoy life, doesn't function. So even depression ultimately turns out to be, of course, a cellular disease. And the first attempts to treat depression were attempts to, as you know, change the chemicals that are responsible for nerves speaking to each other. So drugs like Prozac and Paxil and Zoloft and other drugs are drugs that attempt to change the neurotransmitters, but they don't work very well. Part of the reason, this is a hypothesis, that they don't work very well is that because we don't understand depression at a cellular level. What's the nerve circuit that's gone? What's the mood regulating circuit that's gone wrong? How can we change that mood regulating circuit? And more the belief that it's not just a simple circuit. It's not like sparking a wire or soldering a wire together. But in fact, it's how those wires are connected together with each other, and what the connections are, how deep the connections are, etc., that may be responsible for for the inability of the mood regulating circuits in the neuron. I think that's helpful for many reasons. One of them is that it takes the stigma of depression and converts it from necessarily a psychosocial, grief-related, trauma-related disease, which it certainly is, and looks for a biological locus of it. And typically when you start looking for biological loci of diseases, you suddenly realize that it's your body that's malfunctioning. It's not something you're doing that's wrong. which is typically the language and the rhetoric around mental illness,
Is
particularly
somehow associated with weakness.
yeah, with weakness is you're doing something, snap out of it,
Yeah.
slap yourself out of it,
Yeah.
and you can't slap your neurons, and you can't slap your neurons out of it.
How did you deal with your own depression? Were you able to apply this prism of science looking in when you turned the lens on yourself?
I mean, in many ways, yes, and in many ways, no. I mean, when you experience something in yourself, you can't often turn the prism of science to yourself. But it was, to be honest, it was helpful to know and to understand that there was an organic. I mean, in biology, we use the word organic to describe an illness that originates in cell biology or in biology. It was, and as opposed to something hallucinatory or ghostly or something that lies outside yourself, to somatize it, to make it into something that's part of your body, and to think about it as part of your body for me, it was very helpful, because I thought to myself, okay, well, some people have broken limbs, some people, break their bones. In my case, some circuit in my brain is broken. And my job is to fix it. Now, how does one fix it? Obviously, it's a combination of medicines, various forms of psychosocial help, therapy, etc., etc. But even the simple assumption that it's not my fault, that I can't slap my neurons out of it, as it were, was really helpful.
You describe the cell as the basic unit of life, and then you say, but what is life? And one of the conclusions you reach is that it's like a menu. It isn't any one thing, it's many things simultaneously. What are some of these many things?
Well, so the definition of life has been very challenging, ironically, for scientists. I mean, you would think that it would be very easy. But it turns out it's not very easy. And in fact, life is defined as possessing some qualities. I'll give you some of the qualities. I can't give you all of them. Yeah. So one very important quality is metabolism. So the capacity to turn nutrients into energy, which is the fundamental piece of, is a feature of life. Reproduction. So if a cell can't reproduce, or if an organism can't reproduce, there won't be any more organisms. Yeah. So that's one of the definitions of life. A third one's a peculiar long word. I've written a lot about it, homeostasis, which is the capacity of a system, whatever it might be, to restore balance. Very old idea in science. Even Aristotle spoke about it. There's Vedic writings about it, or they don't use the word homeostasis, but it means the restoration to a normal. Your body, when it's put into, just to give you one example, if I throw you into the Antarctic, your body will have all these systems that will get activated to regulate your internal heat, so that it comes back to as close back to normal as possible. That's an example of homeostasis. So these are some examples. Metabolism, reproduction, homeostasis are some examples. I'll give you things that's something that life is not. So for instance, sentience or consciousness, or even the idea of agency, are not requirements for life. Sentience is not a requirement for. You don't even have to be a sentient human being. Yeast, for instance, yeast cells, or many cells in your body are not sentient. They are not. They have sensors, but they don't have consciousness. They don't have. So those are not requirements for life. But the other ones are.
Now, if I were to say this in a kind of rudimentary layperson's language, my understanding of this is, what keeps us alive also damages us, sometimes simultaneously, hence cancer, hence several autoimmune diseases. Your book starts with a friend who is fighting turns out to be a fatal illness. You think he's getting better. Eventually, he's called Sam in the book. Eventually, he dies. Now, talk about your research where you are using T-cell therapy in clinical trials in India. I don't know how many people know about this, but many more people need to know about it. Joining hands with Kiran Shaw and actually using this therapy in clinical trials to treat people with cancer. How is this working? What is the sort of science behind it?
Well, the science behind it is quite astonishing, and we've actually developed this science further. We have a full unit in Bangalore, which is working on this, and we'll do a very broad press release next week We've already presented the data at one of the most important seminars in cancer called the American Society of Hematology meeting. We presented 5 or 6 papers there, probably a record number for any company in India. The basis of the therapy is that T cells are extracted from the body. They are genetically engineered in a very sort of almost a sanctuary, very, very hyper hygienic sanctuary. One single bacterium, one single contaminant can destroy the entire culture. So T cells are extracted from a cancer patient's body, genetically engineered, and then redirected. Their capacity to kill cells, which is their natural capacity, is redirected to kill cancer cells. And they're reinfused back into the body. With phenomenal success for certain cancers, leukemias, lymphomas, mostly blood cancers. My lab is now very actively trying to extend this into cancers that were previously untreatable. As I said, we'll release the full set of data forthcomingly.
Yeah.
But we've been extraordinarily pleased with what we've done.
I ask you this because we're emerging from the shadows of, 3 years of COVID.
Yeah.
And your book uses a very interesting sort of cultural reference where you speak about the virus as Vamana and humanity, or the human body, as Mahabali. This sort of illustrative example, speak about it.
Well, my books are funny in the sense that I throw in mythology. Sometimes I borrow from Greeks. Sometimes I borrow from stories. There are all sorts of things that are going in. But this particular thing, of course, I don't want to cast the virus. This is just a kind of a more of a story.
License.
Yeah,
Yes,
there's a fair degree of poetic license. But the important thing about all of this is in the famous story, the tiny man asks for enough land. Bali is obviously a magnanimous demon king, and the tiny man approaches him and asks for enough land that he can cover in 3 strides. And Mahabali sort of laughs it off and says, "Of course, you can have 3 strides of land." And then the first stride of land is across the earth. The second stride of land, is across the heavens, and the third, there's no more land to give. And so he pushes his head on foot on Mahabali's head and vanquishes him. But the idea was that we were so puffed up, and by we I mean the community of scientists and researchers, who were so puffed up about our capacity to understand virology and immunology that we thought we had understood everything. And then all of a sudden, this tiny little virus that you can't even see, microscopic, crosses, with 1 foot, crosses across 6 continents, and in 3 strides, all of a sudden, really brings us to our feet. It humbles us, hobbles us.
Yeah.
Mature healthcare systems, the United States, the United Kingdom, and of course, populous states, India, China, etc., are totally humbled by this virus. But also the scientific community is hobbled and humbled because all of a sudden we are discovering things about immunology, about the immune system that we'd never discovered, we never knew before. Yeah. And so, again, with a little bit of poetic license, I sort of really feel as if there was a kind of moment, a kind of come to reckoning moment, not only for the public health community, not only for the political world, but also for the scientific world, and hence that analogy.
I think the wonderful things about your book is that they embrace both the magic and the mystery of science. The mystery is, of course, what science may address in the future, but hasn't yet. And I think I was reading one of your conversations where you said that we should be able to say, we don't know, we don't know, we don't know. So what do we still not know about COVID?
Well, there are many things that we don't know. It's constantly evolving. First of all, right now, at this very minute, we don't know what's happening in China.
Yeah.
And we really need to know because because what's happening there yesterday was going to happen here tomorrow,
Yeah.
whatever it might be, whether it's a benign strain or a relatively benign strain. There's no benign strain, but whether it's a relatively less pathogenic strain or whether it's a more pathogenic strain is something we need to know, because it's going to come in some direction or the other. But on a basic science level, what COVID revealed is that we had a very methodological or methodic understanding of how immunity works against a virus. So we thought that when a virus infects a body, the body mounts an immune response. That immune response is methodical. It undergoes a certain series of or a certain passage of maturity until you mount a mature immune response and you clear the virus. COVID really defied that. This phrase was coined during COVID, which has been in the scientific community, called immunological misfiring. It turns out that the SARS-CoV-2 virus has perhaps a unique or perhaps not a unique capacity, we don't know, but a capacity to contort or distort the immune system, such that the methodical way in which we thought that viruses are attacked by the immune system was totally disrupted. And in fact, all of a sudden, we are realizing that there are things about the way viruses interact with the immune system that we may have ignored. So, for instance, lots of people are talking about long COVID, but maybe there are long syndromes for a lot of other viruses. We don't know, because we haven't looked. Long COVID forced us to look. That's one example. So, for instance, there are people who've been for decades saying that that many autoimmune diseases or many diseases that have been lumped broadly into chronic fatigue are actually long viral syndromes. May not be true, may be true, but now it's a testable hypothesis. And so we're all of a sudden revisiting a lot of these sort of old ideas which we'd thrown out, and revisiting them and thinking, well, maybe there's a virus behind it. Maybe there's a virus behind, some autoimmune problem, which we hadn't noticed before because we hadn't been looking properly.
Fascinating, but let's go from what we don't know to some of the things we do know.
Okay.
IVF, in vitro fertilization, I think you call it one of the most profound sort of cell therapies that has in turn led to, I may not be quoting you verbatim, but a kind of human manipulation. What do you mean by that?
Well, so IVF, in vitro fertilization, of course, has enabled some very important things in human history. Obviously, there are some people, not everyone, but some people have an aching desire to have a child. They cannot. Other people may not have the desire, but some people do. IVF solves that desire, that kind of suffering for those people who want to have a biological child.
Yeah.
Important to say that there are greater social goods that other people might want, like adopting a child or not having a child. Yeah. But for some people, it is an important form of suffering. The sidebar to all of this is that IVF also externalizes the early embryo. By externalizes, I mean it's in a petri dish. Yeah. And once it's in a petri dish, you can do things in a petri dish that you can't do inside the human body, including things like gender selection, including things like maybe genetically changing something in the embryo. And so all of a sudden you've entered a territory which is ethically complicated, biologically complicated, etc. So IVF, might start off by being a reproductive method, but it really becomes very quickly things that are maybe highly undesirable and highly ethically and morally complicated. And I point this out in the book. You often have technologies like this where you begin with some piece of technology and all of a sudden you're in a place where it's completely different from what the origins of that technology was.
In your conversation with Amitav Ghosh in Kolkata, you actually expressed some anxiety that in the future, this sort of engineering, and it probably will get more and more enabled and stronger, could also be used to curb civil liberties. What the fingerprint is today.
Right.
What could that look like? Let's talk a little bit about the new human. Your book also talks about what the new human might look like, what the new debates, the ethical debates, the debates around human rights might look like?
Yeah, so I mean, there have been I mean, this is less to do with cells and more to do
Yes.
with
Genetic,
with with genes in general. But of course, these are related. I told
Yeah.
you how exactly they're related. But one, Amitabh and I were talking about the possibility of genetic fingerprinting. So we were sitting in Alipur jail, which of course is one of the places where human fingerprinting was invented.
Yeah.
As a method of identification of people. And now we've gone on from human fingerprinting to much more complicated things like genetic fingerprinting. So we think of genetic fingerprinting in the context of forensics and criminology. And certainly in the United States and elsewhere, it's allowed us to, for instance, determine criminals using, for instance, blood left on the scene, allowed us to find perpetrators of horrible crimes, including rape and etc. In some ways, of course, enabling forensics and criminology. There is, of course, a dark side to all of this, and that is that we've seen the possibility of every technology being perverted by a surveillance states.
Yeah.
And so you can imagine that, you use the same technology for tracking migrants, tracking dissidents, tracking people that, should be protected, but instead become vulnerable because, they leave a fingerprint. So I guess my point with Amitav, which we both share, is that obviously technology has two sides. And this is one example of the two-sided nature of this technology in particular.
Let's come back to the book. The idea of a cellular civilization, cellular citizenship. What does it mean?
Well, when you get what I call mega cellular organisms like human beings, you often have to have systems of cells that can't live selfishly. Cancer is an example of a selfish cell. Its sort of sole purpose is to make more copies of itself and take over the body. But
is that a kind of narcissism?
Well,
Yeah.
Cancer cells don't have agency, but it's a kind of cellular narcissism.
Yeah.
If one was to again use some poetic license, but more importantly, I think the idea of a cellular civilization is that cells, in order for them to function in the body, take an example of your heart.
Yeah.
There are hundreds of millions of cells in your heart, and yet if the hundreds of millions of cells were to pump discordantly, you wouldn't have blood circulation. They would just be a wobbling balloon. But they do not do that. They function coordinately. And there are very specific reasons, biological reasons, biochemical reasons, by which they function in a coordinated manner. And only that coordinated function allows them to, create a pump. Similarly, the brains in your cell, the cells in your brain, could be, if they were discordant with each other, you wouldn't have a single thought. No thought would spark through your brain. So the idea of a cellular civilization is the idea that these large mega collections of cells have to function coordinately with each other, sing to each other, as it were, to go back to the title of the book, in order for your human body to function. And that's a consequence of millennia of evolution.
Yeah. But, the book talks about, in the space that what we don't know, the liver and the spleen. For example, you have this example where you do not know why the liver is susceptible to a certain kind of cell behavior that the spleen is not. And therefore, it's a bewildering sort of space which you can't, in a way, apply what we know so far to. Do we know why this happens?
We don't, and in fact, that's a very important question. I mean, this question was asked in the late 19th century by the surgeon Paget, the English surgeon, who basically said, why is the liver a frequent site of cancer metastasis, whereas the spleen, which is just next to it, is not a frequent site of cancer metastasis? Why? To understand that, you can't look at the genome. Gene sequencing won't help you. Cell biology will. And so you have to return back to very fundamental questions about cells in order to solve that question. And solving that question is important because we need to understand how cancer metastasizes, where it metastasizes to, because, of course, metastasis is what kills you in the end.
Yeah. Finally, at the end, there are certain exciting developments like the T-cell therapy that you're trying in India. But as you said, there's a lot you don't know. Is there one dimension of something you've been researching that makes you anxious or frustrated, because try as you may, that breakthrough isn't coming, that wall isn't crumbling or even cracking?
Well, I mean, we've been trying a lot. We've actually written a lot about it, and by we, I mean my whole research team, collaborators, etc., etc. We've been trying to understand. We know a lot about the metabolism of cancer. So cancer is dependent on certain nutrients, but we've yet to be able to exploit those vulnerabilities that cancer cells have and make them into a drug. So one question that we've always banged our heads against, have been for a while, is how can we use our understanding of the metabolism of cancer, what cancer eats, and try to make that into a very viable form of therapy. So imagine diet as a drug. Against cancer. So we've put a lot of effort into this. We've made some inroads into this. In fact, we have a big trial that is looking at this. I founded a company called FAETH, F-A-E-T-H, that's going to look at this in greater detail. And I hope we find something, but we're on to something. But it seems like a dim signal that's sort of like a flickering fire in the forest right now.
Well, the dim signal is the way out of that sort of long
tunnel. It's the only way out, yes.
It's the only way out. Siddharth, always learn so much from talking to you, from reading your books. Everybody, if you haven't read it, The Song of the Cell is fascinating. It is brilliant. Don't be scared if you're like me and you're somewhat, sort of a layperson. This makes science accessible, and that is the brilliant thing about Siddharth's writing.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you, Siddharth.
Thank you, my
Always
pleasure.
a pleasure.
Thank you.